welcome to Oh What a Lovely Podcast, where popular culture meets the First World War. Today we are discussing My Soul, a Shining Tree, a novel by Jamila Gavin that explores the First World War from the perspective of children, civilians and a young German soldier caught up in the invasion of Belgium in 1914. Set in the opening months of the war, the novel follows Lotte, a Belgian girl whose world is torn apart as armies move through her village. Through her experiences and through those of a German teenage soldier and an Indian soldier serving with the British Army, Gavin presents the war not as a sequence of battles, but as a human catastrophe that collapses families, identities and certainties. At the centre of the story stands a walnut tree, a recurring presence that becomes a place of refuge, a witness to violence, and a powerful symbol of memory and endurance. Jamila Gavin is widely known for historically grounded fiction for young readers. My Soul, a Shining Tree was the 2025 winner of the Nero Book Awards. The Guardian described it as a supremely poignant and evocative historical novel. The Historical Novels Society review noted that the way Gavin has evoked the First World War and the atmosphere of disconnected chaos is at points breathtaking. I started reading this and didn't like it, and by the end I'd sort of changed my mind. I sort of felt I enjoyed the end more than the beginning with it. I don't know how everybody else felt about it.
I wasn't a huge fan after reading it for a variety of reasons, some of which I can completely understand, and it is a book for younger readers. So, you know, me going, it didn't move me in this way. Well, it wasn't trying to move me in this way. It was trying to move other people, and I'm fine with that. But I did have issues with it.
Yes, as did I. And having read it, I was surprised that it got so much praise as a children's book. There was a lot of exposition, which surprised me, and I did find it very difficult to distinguish between the voices of the three central characters, and then the italicized voice of the walnut tree coming in. And I thought that would be quite confusing for a child because it's doing so much telling of the history and what's going on. What age group is it intended for? I'm
not sure, but because I had exactly similar to you, I couldn't tell. There was very little difference between the voices of the characters and a lot of exposition. But then at times it would smooth everything out, and it was almost then pitching a younger audience than how the exposition was suggesting it was pitching it. So I don't know how old it was supposed to be.
My feeling, it was pitched at parents who would like to teach their kids something useful, and they bought it for the kids who then suffered it.
But then how did the reviewers, the various societies, get so enthusiastic about it?
I think it's because it's not directly about the trenches and the mud and blood, and it's because it's that moment at the start of the war that they've latched onto.
Except there is quite a lot of trench in the battle.
Well, it waffles on and on about trenches and they're fighting in August. So, you know, I'm not sure how much trenches and mud there was, but I overlooked that.
I couldn't get the timeline clear.
Well, that's because there were errors in there. So at one point it mentions that they're attacking tanks that are moving in. It's like, not in 1914, they're not. And at one point there's a thing, I think it's Khadr Khan writing home, and the letter is dated October 2014 instead of October 1914. You know, I very famously have made typos in my own work, so I can understand how this happens. But the timeline, it does end up being like a smorgasbord of First World Warism. So they do talk about trenches quite a lot, despite the fact that there aren't any really.
And I was trying to work out, so Khadr Khan is part of the Indian Army. What I did find effective was talking, the whole section about, actually for both him and for Ernst, the German character, they're writing about their pre-war life and how they became to where they were, how they joined up. That I found some of the most effective bits. That really was quite good. But when Khadr Khan writes about how he gets to Europe, I couldn't work out how quickly he got there.
So they are the Indians are there in October 1940, because that's when he gets his VC.
Yeah, but the odd thing is I got the feeling this was all playing out in August.
Yeah, the timelines of the individual characters and where they're moving around is not... It's difficult to tell at times whether or not there's a a gap between the things and they're all coalescing somewhere.
But they all meet at that walnut tree, which point I'd assumed was still August because it's still the invasion when it's moving.
You get the peculiar thing of, and I can understand again because it's a children's book, that Khadad Khan, he gets his VC for manning a machine gun, and most everybody around him gets killed, and that's effectively what happens in the book. But they take away the aspect of what he was doing with that machine gun, which is shooting a lot of Germans. And that aspect disappears. So simply he was just there and everyone around him got killed. They cut the violence in half. Of the characters are all exposed to violence, but the soldiers are never actually taking part in violence.
There is violence, but a lot of it's violence at the childhood level is bullying. And it's described as bullying in a way that I'm not actually convinced that an enthusiastic cadet at a German military academy would have described something as bullying at the time. But that's sort of all, yes, to make it comprehensible. I was actually quite sad because there are two sort of key secondary characters. One for Ernst and one for KK, which is what Khadad Khan becomes known as. There's Muhammad, KK's friend, and there's Rudy, who's the stretcher bearer, who saves lives and is, he's the philosopher who goes and becomes a stretcher bearer. And they're so underwritten. And I wanted to know more about them and that those relationships. The three different narratives plus the walnut tree just felt like too much for the length of the book it was. It is a short book. We were talking about at the beginning how long it is. It's a short book. There's too much in. And as a result, Lottie's end story, the entire 4 years of war, 1915 to 1918, gets summarized in about 3 pages at the end. The whole story of the Belgian refugees, there's a really interesting story about Belgian refugees that could have been told through Lottie that just gets completely concertinaed into the final pages. And then her relationship with her father is very confusing. There's sort of too many themes, too much going on.
It also blends into other recognizable literature. So as the Belgian refugees, they travel to England and they get kind of fostered, adopted as in that sense. But they get adopted by a character who's kind of a placeholder for Goodnight Mr. Tom, because he's even called Tom, but they refer to him as Uncle Tom, which like that. Also, that's a phrase that means something else. So you can see the blurring of the literary lines with it. And to answer the previous comment about why it was that it got kind of garnered so much attention, is that large portions of this book remind me of In Memoriam, not in the content, but the fact that they are basically the literary equivalent of Oscar bait. They are designed seemingly to appeal to literary awards, and I got a big vibe of that this was almost a book by numbers designed to win awards.
And there's something interesting, because I hadn't realised, Jamila Gavin wrote Coram Boy. It's her first historical novel, and that I know has been assigned on primary school reading lists. So I'm not sure it's necessarily literary awards, but it's certainly school curriculum committees would be my guess.
Did you read the acknowledgements for this?
I did, yes.
Where Alex Watson gets name dropped as somebody who helped out with who was kind of willing to answer questions. I get the feeling that some of the stuff that he flagged up didn't make it into the book. Knowing Alex and having read his books, I suspect that, and again, because of the computer game aspect, I'm actually quite forgiving of creative license, because I understand, as we all do, that the demands of entertainment do not always meet the demands of historians. Nonetheless, there are things that are clearly being roped in, but it's what we've talked about in quite a lot of recent podcasts. Of there seems to be an element where you have to give the audience what they expect. So there have to be trenches, which is a bind for artists.
I'm sympathetic to that. There were trenches. Even in October, there were proto-trenches. I can sort of forgive that. Less forgiving of tanks in 1914. It's the need to shove everything in at the expense of the historical narrative. And what happens is this idea, and we saw it during the centenary as well, this idea that the war is single days. It is the outbreak of war. It is the 1st of July, 1916. It is the armistice, which was implicit in the way the BBC and the British government decided to commemorate. But it loses the fact that this was 4.5 years. And if you're going to write about, particularly the civilian experience of war, but the way in which war impacts lives, all the stuff that Angus was talking about, the focus of the book in his introduction, actually giving a sense of the length of the war. You know, we're coming up to the anniversary of the invasion of the war in Ukraine. And that's 4 years. That's a long time. And I think school children could, have a sense of just how long a time that is, or can be given a sense of just how long a time that is. And that's quite important. And to lose that from this, that to me is the bit that does a disservice to the history.
Although I would suggest that, she's in the tree and she witnesses the invasion and the attack comes to her village. I would suggest if it finished there, that would have been really interesting and have fleshed it out and widened, because it is just a day in a village that's a nondescript Belgian village and the war's passing backwards and forwards over it, and the children fail to get out because their cart comes under fire, so they lose their mother, which is never really, I don't think it's ever really clarified what happens to her.
She gets killed.
Does she get...
Yeah, but the child never actually sees her again.
Disappears.
She just kind of disappears. But she sees her uncle and is like, I knew that he was dead, but I won't tell you how.
She sees her mother flying through the air, But
there's not killed. She could be... Anyway, so they go back to their house. I thought that was a really interesting premise, just to focus on that one day on a functioning... So it sets it up as a functioning village, and then the war passes backwards and forwards through it. But then we get this bit afterwards that then kind of drags the whole lot out, seemingly to rush towards the end to add some sort of full stop to everybody's lives.
Which doesn't work as a full stop to anybody's life, though, is the thing.
No, but that could be because she's trying to write obviously a children's book where children might feel that they need to have a full stop, what happens. Whereas if you just stopped it, I think it would be really interesting. What happens? I don't know. We don't know.
The other option would be to take that image, which it's not done consistently enough to work, but it could if it was done more consistently. The voice of the tree, that walnut tree. And there's a lovely moment where the tree says, all I have to give them is walnuts. And it's a bit like Shel Silverstein's The Giving Tree. It's a rather lovely image that I think children would appreciate. But, you could have the tree as the central character and the witness of the war passing through and then back again, which would allow you to bring in the Indian Army sepoy and his machine gun, the wounded German, without needing to shove it all into far too tight a time frame that feels ahistorical.
My problem with the tree is that this walnut tree is on a rise in the land. So when you climb the tree or you're on the sort of this hill, you can see the armies moving. So Lotta sees the advance, she sees the Germans, the defence is under the tree. That's great. So then the book gets to the end and they go home. But what they don't tell you is that tree has probably been absolutely blown to pieces. So as a symbol of hope and endurance, is probably a stump left in the ground, so there is no hope and endurance.
Well, they don't go home. We leave them in Sussex, it is Sussex, isn't it? Seeing their father, the Sussex Downs.
But they're leaving to go back to Belgium with their father.
Are they? Or no, they've just welcomed the father.
My assumption was they're going back to their land in Belgium.
Yes, that was my assumption as well.
Right. I didn't get that sense that was necessarily what was going to happen, because we don't know what state the father's in. Where has he been for 4 years?
Well, he's been in the army, because this is another interesting aspect. Well, this is actually an aspect that I did find quite interesting, that Belgium's usually sort of set up as passive victim. And actually, Lotta's father is called up before the war starts. He's called up, he's mobilised, he's sent to the army. So he almost disappears in the opening. But I just thought that's and then there is the defence of Belgium, and it is discussed. So rather than that British narrative, remember Belgium, I thought that was an interesting start to the book.
The three perspectives that are brought in are really interesting and underwritten ones, right? Belgian refugees from the point of becoming refugees rather than once they arrive in Britain.
Yeah, which is heavily underlooked at in literature.
German mobilization, which has anybody done that since All Quiet on the Western Front in fictional terms?
There's an aspect of this book, and again, there's no way of knowing. However, the kind of the intertwined narratives, the lives, the Belgian, the German, the walnut tree, the various kind of felt very, very Valiant Hearts, the computer game, to me, because it also has like a Belgian nurse and a German soldier who's mobilized, and you've got like a French farmer, and you do have these lives that kind of intertwine with each other. And there's no way of knowing without asking Jamila Gavin, was there something, did that game interact with you in your life at some point? There's a definite Valiant Hearts element in here of watching the war through the eyes of people who are civilians, even if they are then mobilized into armies.
Because the other point, I mean, there's an interconnectedness to some of this as well. So Ernst, somehow it escapes me, is his grandmother.
He's the son of
his grandmother lives in the village.
His father is related to somebody in the village.
His grandmother's Belgian.
That's it. So I think that these interconnections about Europe are really interesting. And he's a boy soldier. He volunteers underage. Lovely trope there. And obviously there's a girl. To me, the slightly odd one out is the Indian soldier, because why is his narrative with two children? I find it mildly demeaning that you're writing about two children and their view of the war, and then the Indian soldier, I thought, I find it slightly odd. Are you saying he's got a childlike view of the world? How does that fit in? I just find it a bit peculiar.
I wondered if he was being, without being quite as explicitly as Ernst was underage, that he was a very young soldier, because that was the impression I got from his pre-war narrative.
Don't think he is that young in real life.
Sort of got him in his early 20s, and he's sort of joined up because there's nothing.
Born in 1888.
Oh, okay. I'd forgotten those dates. I'm a historian who doesn't do dates.
He's 26.
I just find, I think a third character of a European descent that somehow showed the interconnectedness of Europe would have been interesting.
And there's also, there's Michelle who's just there to illustrate the division between the Flemish and the Walloons.
That's Lottie's friend.
Well, not friend, eventual ally.
Who also gets evacuated. I mean, there was something kind of fun about Belgian inter-identity rivalry thing that doesn't come up very often.
As you say, it's something we've been talking about a lot recently, isn't it? There's all these really interesting strands that as historians we're going, that would be really interesting to explore in more depth and make more rounded, but the need to sort of fit everything.
It just gets blown past so quickly.
Yeah, it means it's really underwritten. And as I say, a lot of exposition. I don't know how much that would, there's a lot of telling people what is going on rather than showing them.
You also get a potted history from some of the characters of the events leading up to the outbreak of the war. And a lot of people basically strategize, so this is going to happen. There was this assassination, and that's a massive deal, and everybody's very worried, and now this is going to happen, and that's going to happen. I was like, okay, we don't, without going full Blackadder here, I can see what you're explaining, and it's the exposition thing. But also, large parts of this aren't true. It wasn't viewed as that big of a deal for a lot of people. That's kind of the point. And this, X will happen, so they're an ally, so they'll declare war, and because they're an ally, they'll declare war, so somebody else will declare war. It's like you're Christopher Clark Sleepwalkers-ing us in real time through this, except by explaining how this is actually going to work, you're unsleepwalkering it, because you're spelling out in vivid detail how these alliances will work.
Well, it's trying to show a bottom-up view of the war whilst at the same time giving you the greater political overview for children, and I'm not sure necessarily that's needed. I think if you just showed it as the bottom-up view from the child's perspective, there'll be much less fussing and worrying, and you'll be able to get more in there than having to explain why it's started.
Well, I think that's where it felt to me like something that was aimed at a school curriculum. This is to support education about.
Would that the English department, or would that be the history department?
Well, there we are, the great debate.
Because I'm not sure I could see it in a secondary school. Well, looking at what my daughter's doing in history, I'm not sure I could necessarily see it in a secondary school history department, but I perhaps could see it in the English department.
But I'm not sure I could see it in a secondary school full stop. given the level of writing. But if it's there for a year 5, 6.
To bolster your kind of, you got a feeling this is an educational thing. When they're doing that, explaining the allied system of the great European powers, I can hear Alex Watson's voice in there, having explained how all of these alliances work. And a lot of that feels like it's moved semi-verbatim into the book.
There is an increasing tendency, isn't there, to do research, asking historians for their expertise and crediting them. But yeah, you have to wonder.
It's the crediting them is the interesting part, because I've in conversation with you both and in like public talks and the like, that I still maintain that the most successful piece of First World War media ever created, or certainly created during the centenary, was the computer game Battlefield 1, which was by EA. It had millions and millions and millions of sales, like an insane number of sales. And people, it's not like buying a cinema ticket. People are playing that every single day online. And I know that they spoke to historians about it, but they all had to sign this standard non-disclosure agreement, which is common for EA and computer games, so none of them get credited. And then a lot of computer game developers after that were like, well, that's a stupid idea. We want people to know that we've spoken to historians. It makes us look like we're good at our jobs. And now they do get credited.
It's somebody else's fault if it's wrong.
Yeah.
So my equivalent of that, as a non-gamer, is Parade's End, which was done as a television program. Actually, it was before the centenary, but Tom Stoppard wrote the script based on the Alex Ford novel. But I know that he went and talked to basically what was then the MA in War Studies First World War Studies at Wolverhampton. It shows, but again, not credited. But that's Tom Stoppard, because Tom Stoppard's really good at doing research and writing it in.
And it's something we should visit sometime, because I quite like to watch it again.
Parade's End, yes. Well, are you going to read the whole book, including the final wildly modernist book in the tetralogy?
I read them all last year. I read them all on Audible.
I don't think I've read it since I did my undergraduate dissertation on it. Anyway, that's getting well away from the subject.
It is.
Also, in regards to crediting historians, sometimes what happens is that somebody, reads a book that was very, very useful, and then they cross out Adrian Gregory's name on it, and they write Jeremy Paxman instead, which is a different form of crediting.
Yes. I mean, it's interesting, crediting Alex Watson in a children's book. We're not going to send our year 6s out to go and read.
But now you point it out, it does make a lot of sense, sort of slipping it into the educational market, especially if you can then have certain authoritative voice somewhere credited at the back.
It's advertising the fact that you have spoken to someone with gravitas, and therefore you know what you're talking about.
See, it would have made a great trilogy. I mean, when I said what partly redeemed it for me is I really liked the bit. So what happens is all the three main protagonists all end up together under the walnut tree, which I found mildly contrived, slightly annoying, and somehow didn't work for me. But then after that, when they all went their separate ways, I really liked the children's story about how they got out and they tried to head to Antwerp or somewhere, and then they can't because it's taken, so they've got to Dunkirk. And I loved that little bit of vignette, and it reminded me of, is it The Mysterious Affair of Styles, where Poirot's kind of with the refugees all arriving in Britain. I'm thinking, this is really interesting. And then, as you say, it sort of rushes. They find a family. They live on a farm. It's like that farm. It's in the South Downs. The family are British, and they have two men serving. And they both get killed, and the kids become their kids, kind of thing. And actually, I thought you've kind of rushed that, but I think that bit's really, really interesting.
If you'd given enough space for each of the individual voices with their stories and their secondary characters, it would have worked much better. Yeah, a trilogy would have been really interesting, right?
Yeah, the Walnut Tree Cinematic Universe.
Well, you could have very much like is it the third season of the League of Gentlemen, where the last the last scene is always the same from someone else's perspective.
Yeah,
if you can remember the season 3,
I can remember the season
with the balloon. That would have been a really interesting way to have done it. So at some point in the book, it all adds to the crescendo of where they meet, and then it moves off again. But it doesn't quite, and to me that never quite works. The German soldier Ernst never feels quite real. I mean, it just doesn't seem to work. It just sounds like nonsense. I mean, it's very interesting. He has his horse shot out from under him twice, doesn't he?
I found him in a sort of All Quiet on the Western Front way quite believable. He never felt quite as. It's interesting. If Kublai Khan felt younger to me than Ernst never felt quite as young as 15.
I also can't remember what happens to Ernst.
He survives the war.
He goes home and he gets a medal. And he goes home and makes up with his father, but Rudy gets killed, of course, because the stretcher bearer has to get killed.
Which is interesting because he has this breakdown at the start of the war where he can't really cope with the war, and then somehow picks himself up in a grand Prussian sort of manner and gets to the end of having fought through the whole thing at every major battle point that you could imagine.
Yeah, like has a ropey beginning, but then pulls himself together to muster up the courage to go through 4 years of grueling attritional warfare.
Because of his sensitive friend with the homoerotic storyline. Someday we will have a stretcher bearer who does not have to bear a homoerotic storyline.
So this isn't going to be on our Christmas list for our children then.
My children are too old for this, I think.
I'm not sure I could persuade Katie to read it.
I mean, what things like this show is, because I think at best we thought it was It's probably kind of the level it's pitched at. But even with it, there's still, as I said, quite a lot of interesting stuff going on, and some of the interest comes from stuff that isn't developed in it, which is a shame, but gives us things to talk about. But there is thus, like, the glimpses of intriguing things in there. I mean, again, the very idea of I'm going to write a children's book and a significant portion of it is going to focus on Belgian refugees. 10 or 15 years ago, it's like, I don't believe that is going to exist. I just don't believe that book will happen.
It might have been more conceivable 10 or 15 years ago, but I think it would have still been a hard sell to do one that had a central character who is an Indian army sepoy.
And again, how much of this is a post-centenary thing is interesting, bearing in mind that we're only 2 years away from now, 10 years since the centenary finished, which is horrifying.
Yeah, there's a lot in there that doesn't usually float to the surface. I mean, it's such an early period to mention the British Army as well, which is somehow miraculously arrived. We're not quite sure where it is. I honestly thought it was start of August. I couldn't believe how quickly they'd got there. I thought I had been Googling when the British Army first went into action, which is sort of early to mid-September.
Because it shifts in time. So you go from a chapter with Lottie which is in August. Actually, it might even be July into August. And then you get a chapter from Kublai Khan, which it has to be after September at the earliest. That's interesting. So that first battle scene, just going back to Angus's point about the tree getting blasted out of existence by the end of the war, that first description of a battle scene and the trenches describes a battle scene circa 1916 where there's been an awful lot of heavy artillery. Proto-trenches I can take. A blasted, muddy battlefield in September, October 1914. No.
But there again, the village battle is interesting because the village is intact and the battle blows it to pieces as the men sweep backwards and forwards in the battle, which you wouldn't get in 1916 because. But
we've already had an interaction between Lottie and KK, which involves a description of a battlefield as blasted out of existence. So this is what I meant about really not understanding the timeline, and I think that's possibly what's affecting your understanding is. In moving between the voices, that's fine, but you have to be then consistent about time, or you can move between time but be consistent about the voices. Doing both at the same time is really confusing, and I think is a disservice to the children who are reading it, probably, because it's going to give them a really odd sense of what those early days of the war were like, whereas there was real potential, as I think we've identified, for telling a very original story about what the early days of the war were like, which hasn't been told very often.
To answer Angus's question about kind of the British timeline, Mons is 23rd of August. So, and then Lecato's a couple of days after that. So, the British go into action pretty quickly.
But some of the stuff about when she's frightened that the Germans are arriving, that must be the end of August?
Maybe, again, and it gets
it's
blurred because they
talk
talk
July,
about...
rather?
Yeah, they talk about...
Because it starts before Germany declares war on France.
And there's references to, as I said, Antwerp, and they're all on the road, the men in road to Ypres. And I think at one point it does get referred to as wipers, which is I think that feels very early for that term to be emerging.
Khudad Khan in the first chapter he appears refers to it, says that the British refer to it as wipers. Yeah.
I don't think the British have been there yet.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
We haven't mentioned that the title itself is actually drawing on a Siegfried Sassoon poem.
No, we're never more than 2 feet away from a Siegfried Sassoon reference.
Or I think a canonical poems reference. Let's see, Owen gets to shoulder some of the blame here.
We also get John McCrae at the very end of the book. It's the last thing that gets written.
Yes, My Soul is Shining, which was written in 1916.
But it's an oddity for a book that's quite deliberately about non-British. I couldn't quite see where Sassoon and Sassoon's experiences fitted with any of the perspectives that she was trying to evoke. Well,
my assumption is because it's a tree and it's this idea of roots and connections to the land and interconnections.
But she talks about it as being the thing that inspired the book.
But there again, it comes back to my point that I would have thought the tree would be shattered to pieces, and it kind of breaks the idea of the poem when it's...
My soul a blasted tree.
Yeah, when it's uprooted, the roots have gone, and it didn't quite work.
And now there's one of those fake trees that snipers used in its place.
Simulacra of a tree. Perhaps this is a simulacra of a book referring to the First World War as it hits all the tropes that we expected to have.
That's a little unfair, but
you're not going to put that on the poster.
But yeah, I agree with your first point, Chris, that it had a very in memoriam feel. It's ticking boxes rather than doing anything as creative. And again, the sad thing is that it had such potential.
But there's also that element of, I'm not upset that it exists, partly because there is some interesting stuff in there, and there does seem to be like an ongoing First World War artistic representing movement at the moment. We've read quite a few novels in the last few podcasts, and the more stuff that comes out, at some point we're going to sit down here and go, this was amazing, it absolutely blew my mind. Well, not this time, obviously, but who knows, maybe next time.
Well, it's an interesting point, the idea of movement. There is movement in this, it's not quite as static. Again, we've looked at the past 1917, again, it's about movement, not necessarily sitting in trenches, which is, I guess, breaking a trope that we had, that they all just sat in trenches for 4 years and didn't move.
And I suppose there is the aspect that we are First World War historians. We are very familiar with this story.
Yeah, we're not the audience here.
And we're very familiar with the tropes, so we can get a little bit jaded, perhaps. But I think, if this is designed as an educational tool, I think the misrepresentations, because of the attempt to fit too much in, are a real problem here.
Do we think we've mined this enough?
Yeah, I reckon so.
So what are we talking about next time out?
We are talking about Agatha Christie's Seven Dials. Seven Dials Mystery, I should say.
This is the latest... Is it BBC?
Netflix.
Or is it Netflix?
The
Netflix miniseries.
On Netflix, it is... The full title is Agatha Christie's Seven Dials Mystery. Although we might try and read the book as well.
I will have to watch again. I can't remember anything about it, but I seem to remember washing over me and enjoying it at the moment I watched it.
There's a fair few references to the war, which I don't think were in the original, because as far as I remember, Agatha Christie never mentions the war, so it's going to be an interesting one.
Very good. I look forward to it. Right, well, if that's it for this episode, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good work, everyone.